Since the beginning of October, there has been a slight shift in polling averages favoring Donald Trump, especially in key battleground states. The shift has some Democrats worried that the momentum Kamala Harris built after she took over as the Democratic nominee has fizzled. Still, polls remain within the margin of error, less than 2 weeks until Election Day in what could end up being the closest presidential race in recent history. Joining me now is the Hill's senior editor, Jesse Byrnes, to help break down the latest news from Washington. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thanks, Drew.
These national polls still very close, but do show Harris with a slight edge. The latest from UMass Amherst says Harris has a 2-point national lead. Trump can still obviously win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. He did it in 2016. Over the last few weeks, the Harris campaign seems to have been focused more on Donald Trump's actions post-2020, January 6th. There are some, including GOP pollster Frank Luntz, who says this is a mistake. What do you think about where she's at in the polls and how that correlates to her messaging over the last few weeks?
Well, it's interesting seeing a lot of new registrations for Republicans. Democrats have long been favored. Going back to 2004 was the last time a Republican actually won the popular vote. And so for the last 2 decades, Republicans have really struggled when it comes to the popular vote. And so, we saw this with Trump in 2016 and 2020. Vice President Harris is more than likely to win the popular vote. But as you know, it all comes down to the Electoral College. And right now, Trump is in pole position when it comes to those battleground states. That blue wall doesn't look like a very solid wall for Democrats. And so she is trying to figure out what are the issues that really resonate with voters. And apparently, their inside polling must indicate that this is an issue that is strong for her. Otherwise, she wouldn't be hammering on it so close to the election. We've seen her pull out former Republican Representative Liz Cheney, who used to be the number 3 Republican on Capitol Hill in the House, and of course has been very critical of Trump, and using her as a top surrogate on the issue of election security, democracy, trying to go after Trump on this issue. And now we have these comments from former Chief of Staff Mark Kelly, who also as former 4-star general, criticizing Trump, saying he's a wannabe dictator. These all play into that narrative that Harris is leaning into, and of course it's coming 2 weeks before the election. It's not a coincidence.
Yeah, we're going to get to those Kelly remarks here in a second, but it seems like all this is a play for moderate Republicans, Nikki Haley voters, never Trumpers. It's a little bit of a risk, it would seem, for the Democrats to be relying on Republican voters to win an election, but do you think it could work?
It's possible. I mean, look, in all of these states in this blue wall, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, it's going to come down to a few thousand voters. And if the polling is accurate, as I think there's this big question, are these polls going to really reflect, is the vote going to reflect what these polls are showing, that it's a razor-tight race, 51-49, 50-50, maybe just a few thousand votes here or there. Anything can make the difference. Foreign policy typically isn't a deciding factor. This election, it could be a deciding factor. Places like Michigan with the large Arab American vote. And so I think on this thing, look, Harris has to pull all the levers that she has at her disposal. And when you have a good chunk of former Trump administration officials and former Republicans who are going out there and hitting the standard bearer of the Republican Party, you're going to lean into that. So it's not a surprise. Will it actually make the deciding factor? Maybe not. One thing, too, just to point out here, she has it's a risky strategy because she is attacking Trump, and in many of these places, voters like Trump, and so she's going after Republicans who maybe voted for Trump once and are on the fence. And so for her, she has a very fine line of not insulting those voters, but still trying to convince them to support her.
And not really driving home on the most important issues like the economy, where
exactly.
Voters say that's really what they want to hear about. Let's talk about John Kelly, former Chief of Staff to President Trump when he was in office. He's also a former 4-star Marine general. He had some stark warnings for the American people, saying that Trump would run the country like a dictator. He says the definition of fascism accurately describes Donald Trump. He also was reported in the Atlantic to have praised the loyalty of Adolf Hitler's generals. Vice President Harris responded to that today. Let's take a listen to what she said.
It is clear from John Kelly's words that Donald Trump is someone who, I quote, certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, who in fact vowed to be a dictator on day one and vowed to use the military as his personal militia to carry out his personal and political vendettas. Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable.
Now, I just want to make clear that the Trump campaign has denied that that he ever made those comments about Hitler's generals. But What do you make of this Atlantic article, and do you think it kind of breaks through the political noise in Washington?
Well, look, John Kelly is known for the last couple of years, the last several years, as being very critical of Trump. You know, he was the person who broke the report that Trump called Americans buried in France losers and suckers. You know, Trump has long denied that. They've long argued over it. And so going back to 2020, John Kelly has been an outspoken critic of Trump. He's Trump's longest former chief of staff. Trump had multiple, as you remember, and he's the one that served with Trump the longest in that position. But is this really going to make a difference with voters? I would be very skeptical of that, just based on the reality that he has long been critical of Trump, and he has done it so publicly with The Atlantic, with the New York Times, with other media outlets, and he's very much clear on the record. Now, he's coming forward because of Trump's own comments recently in the last couple of weeks, talking about the enemy from within. And I think there are even some Republicans who are saying Trump is maybe going too far with that kind of rhetoric so close to an election. But is John Kelly going to be the deciding factor? Very unlikely.
John Bolton, another former Trump official, national security advisor, has also been warning about the dangers of Trump. He said on CNN that the former president is dangerous but incapable of being a fascist, essentially saying he's not smart enough to have a coherent political philosophy in that sense. But you said it, Bolton and Kelly are kind of part of this chorus of national security officials that Harris has been trying to tout as supporting her in a play for those Republicans. I just wonder if at any point it breaks through, they can make for good ads. You know, I know you said that you're skeptical that it can, but again, in an election that's maybe decided by such slim margins, is there a chance that it could really make a difference?
Yeah, I think with someone like Bolton, you know, there are issues where he has actually shown that he's not criticizing Trump, right? So I think he's at least approaching it from a little bit more balanced view of, you know, even though it's a very backhanded, you know, Trump's not smart enough to be a dictator type of thing. And so with Bolton, I think it's a little bit different than with Kelly. Kelly has just been much more critical in general. You know, Mark Milley, Trump's former the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was a holdover, but he was working with Trump for several years. He also called him, you know, said he would believe in fascism based on his own view of how Trump operated in his outlook. And so, look, there's just a parade of these former officials who are willing to go after Trump. Do Trump voters actually care about that? Trump has always positioned himself as this outsider, as this person who's willing to take on the system. Even we saw him in Chicago recently saying, you know, that all the economists are wrong when it comes to tariffs and that he's the only one going back decades who has this right. That is what Trump voters, that is who they're voting for. They're not voting for him or not going to vote for him because a parade of former officials don't like him. Even though, you know, as you noted and as the vice president noted, these are people who had a very up-close view of how he operated in the White House for several years, but it doesn't seem to be resonating. Now, could it resonate among some people who maybe voted for Nikki Haley in the primaries, who may be that very small sliver of never-Trumpers who still respect, you know, Liz Cheney, potentially, but it's a very, very increasingly smaller slice of the electorate.
I want to talk about the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, Jamie Raskin. He's warning that the Trump campaign is not participating in the process of that candidates normally participate when it comes to the transition, not working with the Biden administration. He's also made accusations that the transition team is flouting fundraising reporting requirements, sidestepping rules in place to prevent conflicts of interest. How big of a deal is this lack of coordination between the current administration and the prospective administration should Trump actually win?
Well, I don't think it's a huge deal up until it becomes a major deal. And if it does become an issue, then it's going to be critical, right? And so, you know, behind the scenes, as you're aware, you know, covering Washington, campaigns typically do coordinate with the federal government because on day one, they want the President of the United States, they want the White House staff to be able to hit the ground running. So they oftentimes will brief the President, they'll brief his national security team. And so the federal government does provide certain services, whether it's computers, technical support, you know, national security, top classified information to both candidates and both teams, because on day one, it's kind of like the Super Bowl. They will print the logo for the T-shirts and the hats and for both sides, and then, you know, whoever wins, they actually will roll it out. Same thing here. Both sides are basically getting access to certain information from the federal government, and it seems like the Trump team isn't actually playing ball right now, but that will likely obviously change come November 6th if in fact Trump wins. wins, I think you're going to see his team become very cooperative when it comes to wanting to get these things tidied up and not have any kind of delay.
All right, Jesse Byrnes, that's all I got for you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Drew.
Former Abercrombie & Fitch CEO Mike Jeffries was released Tuesday on a $10 million bond after he and 2 others were arrested earlier in the day on sex trafficking charges. The New York indictment accuses Jeffries of using his position as CEO to lure men into sex parties on the promise of a modeling career with the company. News Nation's Caitlin Becker breaks down the indictment. Caitlin?
Well, force, fraud, and coercion. That's how the feds say former Abercrombie CEO Mike Jeffries, along with 2 others, allegedly lured in prospective male models and duped them into an alleged sex trafficking scheme. Prosecutors claim that between 2008 and 2015, Jeffries, his romantic partner Matthew Smith, and their recruiter James Jacobson, quote, used their money and influence to prey on vulnerable men for their own sexual gratification. Now, the 16-count indictment uncovers what authorities claim is the brutal truth behind one of the most recognizable brands during the height of their success. The 3 defendants are accused of promising men modeling gigs at Abercrombie & Fitch as a way to trick them into participating in, quote, sex events, where the men would be required to perform sex acts whether they consented to them or not. The use of drugs and alcohol were said to have been used to force their compliance, behavior the U.S. attorney called, quote, abhorrent. Jeffries served as CEO of Abercrombie from 1992 to 2014 and was responsible for crafting that glossy, sun-kissed version of the brand that became known for excluding any body types that just didn't fit the mold. Now, the brand was used as a tactic to allegedly lure in these victims, but the U.S. attorney was clear that authorities don't believe the company was aware that anything nefarious was going on.
We don't allege in the indictment that the resources of Abercrombie & Fitch were used in furtherance of this criminal activity. But what we do allege and acknowledge is that the fact that Michael Jeffries was CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch was utilized, and the potential of an opportunity at Abercrombie to be in an ad or things like that were some of the carrots that I think people perceived as what they would achieve by participating in this activity.
Now, 15 John Does are listed in the indictment. However, court documents reveal that there are dozens of alleged victims. All 3 defendants were arrested on Tuesday morning, and they're going to be arraigned here in New York at a later date. Now, the investigation into this case is ongoing, and the U.S. attorney is encouraging anyone who believes that they were victimized by these 3 to come forward. Back to you.
Machinists at Boeing will vote today on a tentative agreement that, if approved, would end a weeks-long strike. Union workers walked off the job more than a month ago, halting production and costing Boeing around $100 million in revenue per day. The tentative deal proposes a 35% wage hike over the next 4 years, a $7,000 one-time ratification bonus, and beefed-up retirement benefits. Even if the union ratifies the deal, Boeing won't be in the clear. The FAA has ramped up oversight of the airline manufacturer following several high-profile incidents, including the Alaska Airlines flight earlier this year that experienced a door plug blow off shortly after takeoff. The company reported a $6.17 billion loss over the last 3 months, the second worst quarter in the manufacturer's history. In his first remarks to investors, newly appointed CEO Kelly Ortberg laid out his plan to turn the company around, saying Boeing needed a fundamental culture change. Starting in 2026, millions of Americans could save more on each paycheck. The Internal Revenue Service announced changes to tax brackets to compensate for inflation. More than 60 tax provisions are changing for 2025. That means you won't see the changes until you file in 2026. Standard deductions are also set to increase. Individuals will be able to deduct an additional $400, and married filers can deduct as much as $800. The changes will also increase the earned income tax credit by a little over $200 for filers with 3 or more children. Republicans have been making an effort this year to challenge ballots cast by Americans living and working overseas, and even in space. But how many Americans cast their votes while abroad? News Nation's Blake Berman breaks down the numbers in today's Political Minute.
Americans voting from an ocean away. I'm Blake Berman with News Nation. Americans living outside the United States are allowed to vote in U.S. elections. through the 1976 Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act. American voters living abroad cast absentee ballots in their former state of residence. Approximately 4.4 million Americans live abroad. That's according to the Federal Voting Assistance Program, though other estimates do put that number higher. That includes active U.S. military members, their families, and other citizens. For example, in the 2020 election, an estimated 47% of active duty military and 8% of Americans living in foreign countries voted. In 2016, basically the same numbers, 46% of active military, 8% of other Americans who live abroad. By the way, the two Starliner astronauts who are still stuck in space right now will cast ballots from the International Space Station. I'm Blake Berman. This is the News Nation Political Minute.
Thank you, Blake. Happening now, McDonald's franchises in at least 10 states are pulling a classic staple off their menu. The Quarter Pounder is no longer being sold after an E.Coli outbreak linked to the iconic sandwich left one person dead. That one reported death was an elderly person in Colorado. So far, a total of 49 people have gotten sick between September 27th and October 11th, but that number is expected to grow. 10 of the people have been hospitalized, including a child who developed a kidney infection. Health officials say that early evidence is putting blame on the slivered onions on McDonald's Quarter Pounders. The fast food chain says they've traced the onions back to a supplier that serves at least 3 distribution centers. Right now, the state with the most cases is Colorado, but cases have also been reported in Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Oregon, Utah, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. If you think you or someone you know may have been exposed to E. coli, be on the lookout for symptoms like fever, especially one over 102 degrees, diarrhea, severe stomach cramps, and vomiting. If you suspect an infection, go see a doctor. Meantime, the Food and Drug Administration says they're looking into where else those onions have been sold or served. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.